Gotcha. So the organization itself has been around for about 25 years. We know the history of the land going all the way back to the 1640s, though. This would have been part of a grant to from the Virginia colony to a private owner. At the turn of the 18th century, 19th century, so end of the American Revolutionary War, this land would have been, at that point, part of a 4,000 acre grant from the US government to a general whose last name was Hoffler, and that's where Hoffler's Creek gets its name. He was granted 4,000 acres east of Hoffler's Creek, moving into Portsmouth, what was then Norfolk County, and is now Portsmouth, Virginia today. He passed it down to his heirs and successors and kind of split up the properties into smaller and smaller ones throughout the generations until 1900. A gentleman named John Ballard II was the last individual to own the property. He brought his wife out here. They had 6 kids and a couple of cousins living at the house that was out on the property. They had 600 or 800 acres. We're not exactly sure how much land they had at that point in time. And they farmed it. They did what's called truck farming, but eventually started selling cut flowers out here. By the 1950s, they realized that that was no longer going to be as profitable as it had been. The family started looking for some ways to keep the property sustainable until mom and dad passed away. Kind of keep the taxes paid, keep the roof repaired. And what they actually did was contact the Department of Forestry, Virginia Department of Forestry, who came out and planted all of the loblolly pine trees that we have on the property. The story goes, they planted them a little too close together. They didn't grow fast enough to log it and make enough money to do that. So they had to start looking for some other options. Started selling off pieces of the property until they had what was left here today, 142 acres, when mom passed away in 1970. Department of Transportation purchased the property when the family put it up for sale as part of her estate, and they came out and started digging a big pit at the center of the property that we now call Lake Ballard. It was a borrow pit, so they were using the sand there to build up the roadway where 164 meets 664. This would have been in the 70s in anticipation of the Modern Rear Act going in. They used the sand to build up the on-ramps and off-ramps. And when they find the right kind of sand, the stuff that's not going to vibrate or settle too much with vibrations of our cars and trucks going over top of it, they'll go really deep. So they actually had gone 58 feet deep out there by summer of '79. And there was a drought in the area that year. The local neighborhood realized that the more often they were watering their lawns, the faster they were dying. In order to get to 58 feet deep out so close to the river, they had to keep water pumps running 24 hours a day. So the trucks weren't getting stuck in the mud, that sort of thing. And in the process they created or encountered, I'm not sure whether they ran into it or they made it themselves, what's called a seep. Basically an underground river, and they were contaminating the well water, the local well water here, with salt water from the James River through this underground river. They immediately withdrew from the property, turned it back to the state of Virginia to do environmental impact studies to make sure that that wasn't going to be an ongoing problem, also to settle a few lawsuits until, and so by 1995 they had settled most of those. The state was looking for a way to raise some additional money, and one of the ways that they considered doing that was selling old Department of Transportation properties, including this one. Well, a contractor put in a successful $1.5 million bid. He was going to be able to put in 188 waterfront properties out here. And at that point, that's when the local neighborhood got involved. Our first executive director came out here before we were an organization. Tried to convince them not to go forward with it, and they were basically like, sorry lady, we're going to make a lot of money off of this. They didn't realize that the lake had never been mitigated. It was just allowed to fill up. So it's still 58 feet deep, and it's almost straight down on one edge. Because the way they dug it out, it's still the same way pretty much that it was. And because of our proximity to Crane Island, we're subject to some rules and regulations by the Army Corps of Engineers. This is a picture from We know this is taken sometime after 1991 because the bridge is there. This is the modern Merrimack Bridge Tunnel. This is Craney Island. It's industrial fill, where anytime the Army Corps of Engineers, the state of Virginia deepens the port or widens a channel for a bigger cargo ship or aircraft carrier, this is where they pour the industrial or the sand that they take from the bottom of the river, the sand and the silt. And this is us here. So anything within 150 feet of our shoreline that is being done below the surface of the dirt has to be signed off by the Army Corps of Engineers. They have what's called a mitigation zone.
Okay.
All the damage they do here, they have to make up for it in local waterways around it. So that's adding shoreline buffers or installing oyster reefs to encourage larger wildlife populations other places. And so we are among that. And so when our first executive director let him know that, contacted some environmental lawyers, wrote him some friendly letters, he decided to withdraw. He realized it was going to be more expensive and take longer than he expected. And that point, the state offered the city of Portsmouth this property to be used for environmental conservation for $1. And the city told them no. They had heard 188 waterfront properties. That's a lot of tax revenue for a city that was already starting to lose some population. So I think city council realized they probably weren't going to get reelected if they turned down the possibility of that tax revenue. They didn't have any money in their Parks and Rec department for a place like this to begin with. So they spent the next year trying to find another contractor. And in the meantime, Randy Stretton stayed busy. By the completion of 12 months, she stepped back to city council. She said, have you guys found a developer, contractor willing to develop that property? And when they said no, she said, well, I have raised $150,000. This is where we want to put our trails. This is where we're going to put our learning center. Why don't you let us take it on as stewards of the property? And so the city of Portsmouth at that time coalesced, and they accepted the property from the state of Virginia with Hoffler Creek Wildlife Foundation as its stewards. So the city technically owns the property, but we've been taking care of it and are responsible for the upkeep of the trails and the buildings and managing the property, staffing it on a regular basis as a nonprofit.
Okay.
So that's what we've been doing.
So as a nonprofit organization, how this place is sustained, like economically?
Yeah. So we get a small, well, it's not small, but it's smaller than it used to be. At one point, we had a large contribution that came from the city. At this point, we receive between a quarter and a third of our annual budget from the city. The rest is made up of grants that we write to state and governmental organizations, so the Department of Forestry or Department of Games and Inland Fisheries, Environmental Education Foundation, organizations like that provide grant funding to us. And then the rest is made up by individual and organizational support. So it's everyone from the Rotary Club of Portsmouth to the Pilot Club or local garden clubs, organizations like Wall Einhorn Insurance, they're the lawyer's office here in the city. They contribute $1,500 to us each year for our special events and fundraisers and things like that. So all those build up, and then the last element of that is membership. Family or households and individuals can join us as members for between $40 and $60 a year. Takes us about $100 per acre per week to kind of keep things going here and offer as many environmental education programs as we currently do. We'd like to be able to offer more of those down the road, but that's pretty much what it takes.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's nice. What are the things you value the most of this place and what makes it special?
So one of those advantages to being a nonprofit is that we can be focused on the health of the habitat here for environmental education and research purposes in a different way than many city and state organizations would be. City and state organizations, they're worried about the things that are walking around on two legs, the people in their communities, whereas we focus on the habitat, the actual health of the wildlife here. So we are a little bit more restrictive about our use of the property. That's why we are only open 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. It's from 10 to 4 Tuesday through Saturday, or Tuesday through Sunday. We don't allow dogs out on the trails. We don't allow jogging out on the trails, and it's to minimize human impact so that we can maximize the health of a very isolated habitat within a largely, rural or urbanized area. And so we have seen a couple hundred species of birds out there. I think we're up to 215 or 220 different species of birds. We have deer, raccoon, opossum, everything you'd expect in the Hampton Roads area naturally. We support on this property this time.
Okay. Basically you answered my
The next
other
question?
Yeah, what type of flora and fauna you have?
Well,
examples.
Yeah, so that actually ties into one of your other questions about the types of habitat that you might see here. So we do have 3 distinct different types of habitat, and all those are going to be supportive of slightly different flora and fauna. So first off, most of what we have here is forested area. So it would be a southern pine forest, the loblolly pine trees primarily. We started seeing some succession in those forest areas, whereas the loblolly pine trees naturally die off or are outgrown by other trees that we would expect to see in this region. That happens. So we see chestnut oaks out there. We also have American holly trees, southern magnolias, a number of maple oak trees, sycamores. What else? Sweet gum trees. What else? There's a number of different trees out there. A lot of vine species and the other things that you'd expect to see in a forest as well: trumpet vines, Virginia creeper, poison ivy. The birds that are associated with those are variant, and that always depends on the year or the time of year, more specifically. So we see a lot of woodpeckers that may stick around. We have some resident great horned owls that are always out there. We've got 2 mating pairs on the property right now, and for many years we had a couple of bald eagles that had a nest out there. At one point, we had a camera pointing on their nest.
Wow.
So very cool little thing. The next area that we have, and probably the most important, at least regionally, is going to be the salt marsh. So that's going to be the edge along our property there on Hoffler Creek, and that supports everything from oysters to wading birds and other waterfowl, and provides great fishing resource to a lot of the birds that might call this place home, the eagles and the kingfishers. And then we have a small area, it's not huge, but a meadowed area that kind of serves as a pollinator garden. So we have a lot of wildflowers and different grasses out there that support everything from monarch butterflies to a number of brush birds, bluebirds, that sort of thing. Of course, making the use of all of that area, then you have deer, opossum, raccoon, fox. We see an occasional coyote or 2 along the shorelines in the water. We have the oysters and the jellyfish and the fish and everything else that we'd expect out there as well. And then on the lake itself, probably see more turtles than anywhere else in Hampton Roads come summertime.
What are some of the threats you encounter as an organization, and also for the flora and fauna? What is the most difficult part to maintain this special area?
So actually one of our biggest challenges is what's called non-native invasive plants. Are you familiar with those at all? Okay, so we have a number of troublesome species. There's about a dozen of them. Our highest priority ones at this point in time are going to be English ivy and Chinese privet, also known as ligustrum. They, of course, cause a number of problems. First off, they wedge out the natural plants that we'd expect to be there. Next, they actually alter the composition of the soil. So the soil filters water a little bit differently as it's moving out into the Chesapeake Bay. It may not contain the same nutrients that we had expected to. It may not be bringing the same minerals into the larger waterway in support of the plankton and algae that's out there. But one of the biggest concerns is actually the risk of forest fire. These non-native plants have a competitive advantage over everything else that's around them, so they grow so densely that they, one match and kind of just spreads very rapidly. We've seen wildfires like that spread in California in the last year and things like that. And it's largely to do with the disturbed property. Property is where human interaction has actually altered the natural balance of the organisms there. So we do a large bit of work, a good bit of our focus is actually to manage those non-native invasive plants. We use a number of methods, including mechanical, just pulling it straight out of the ground or chopping it down, as well as applying herbicides when necessary. And we try to keep that as limited as possible, keep it as natural as possible. But in certain areas, an herbicide, Roundup, something like that is absolutely necessary in order for us to keep up with the rate of expansion of these non-native plants. So that's going to be the biggest thing. So, yeah.
What laws protect this undeveloped area on an organization?
So really there isn't a specific law.
Okay.
We have what's called a memorandum of understanding with the city. It's kind of like a lease. You might sign with a landlord, only ours says that they're going to pay us to take care of the property rather than us paying them for the property. Now that ensures our organization's operations as long as they are consistent with that memorandum. So a couple of the things that we have to do is offer volunteer events. We have to offer regular public access. We have to offer a couple of other things as an organization to the people and the individuals here and schools and things like that in the community in order for them to consider it an acceptable arrangement. Now, they hold the property under a deed from the state of Virginia. The deed from the state of Virginia says that the city of Portsmouth can have this property as long as it is used for conservation and environmental education, or developed as a whole. At this point, it is being used for conservation. But there is always the risk that, hey, if the city had to declare bankruptcy, there may be a rearrangement of that. They may say, hey, we got to start looking at other options. There is that potential. So
that's a threat for the organization as well.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be. The city seems to be in a pretty good solid footing. I think they have shown a commitment working with us and Elizabeth River Project on a project called Paradise Creek, which is on the other side of town, a commitment to environmental education and having these resources available both to the citizens and the classrooms that call the area home. So assuming nothing really catastrophic happens, I don't see a really big problem there. And as far as development, that lake, the same reason why the contractor turned it down in 1995 is why a contractor presumably would have trouble developing the property today. Those same rules are in application. So while our area is becoming more and more developed, I don't have an estimate, but our property, the land here is not worth the same as like the land in Manhattan, and so the value of actually doing that isn't high enough probably at this point for us to really worry about it.
We can go outside.
Yeah? Want to?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
For visitors, what are things they can do?
So we have 3 miles of hiking trails for wildlife viewing. We offer kayaking when the weather allows. It's a little cold to get out there today, but we do that generally April through October.
Okay.
Is when you could rent a kayak from us out here. You can also bring your own kayak. We also offer field trip programs, so field trips for our local school kids throughout the year. We can do those year round. We have 5 oyster floats where local schools actually raise their own oysters and do that. They come out once a month to take measurements as part of biology or neuroscience curriculum. And of course, plenty of wildlife viewing out here. The widgeons out on the lake have been a really big hit. There's about 250 of those ducks out there, including a couple of weird Eurasian widgeons
Mhm.
in with the group of American widgeons that have apparently been a big hit with a lot of our birders lately.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Activities?
Yeah.
Do activities?
Well, we do a number of wildlife programs as well. So throughout the year, we'll have local rehabilitators, individuals who are working to rescue animals, that sort of thing, come out, present their ambassadors. So
Okay.
whether those are owls or flying squirrels, those sorts of things. A couple of weeks back for Valentine's Day, we led a sunset walk and then came back and enjoyed some chocolates and some wines
Okay.
back at our headquarters. So, you know, we try and stay busy all year round with a little bit of everything. Our biggest events of the year are our spring fling and our fall festival, where we bring in well, anywhere from 250 to 1,000 people, families, really kind of oriented towards our kids, with crafts activities. For Easter, we do an Easter egg hunt. For a fall festival, we'll of course do a spooky trail and a hay
Okay.
ride along the trails for Halloween.
Okay.
So.
You, as the director of this organization, what is the vision for this organization? What do you want to achieve in short and long term?
Gotcha. So, you know, of course, to a large degree, that's actually driven by the guidance of our board of directors. They're a governing board, and they determine our strategic vision. You know, it's something that I'm a part of, but the things that we've identified is we want to play a larger role as an educational resource to our community. So we've started working with the elementary school much more frequently that we're so close to. That's Churchland Primary, right? 3/4 of a mile walking from here. But we'd like to be able to serve a role to all of the schools, any school that potentially needs or can find the value of having hands-on immersive learning to supplement what the children are already learning in the classroom. We also already support a couple of universities out here for ongoing studies, projects that go back as far as 25 years. So that is our first big thing. We are struggling and always working towards inviting more and more of our community into the preserve. There are some historical challenges in the South for bringing people of all colors and backgrounds into nature and actually being able to enjoy and recreate in that. And we're trying to work on that as an organization through telling better stories about the history of the property, the individuals that lived on it, as well as the value of our water, our trees in urban, increasingly urban communities.
So the community benefits from this organization, right?
Yep. Oh yeah,
Education.
absolutely. I mean, it starts just with property value. There's greater property value to the homes around us. To have a resource like this. But yeah, the community really does, because once you start enforcing or giving children the opportunity to appreciate and enjoy their time on the water, whether that's on a kayak or understanding the way a watershed or a habitat, the importance of a habitat here and the number of creatures that they can support, well, you start seeing them, they're less likely to throw their empty soda bottle into the drain and actually
appreciate things.
Exactly. And so that's what we're really working towards.
Okay. What ecosystem service is offered by this natural preserve organization?
Well, so we offer a number of services on top of providing resources to the watershed with our oyster reef, as well as the oysters that the children are ruling there. This is a great safe place for a number of species. It's a stopover place for a number of species. These widgeons will move on somewhere. We've got a couple of members who also do duck hunting, and they don't do duck hunting here, but they're glad to see this many birds here, because that means in the places that they can normally do it, they can continue enjoying those types of recreation. And those birds, and the birds that call this home, and the other wildlife, work as an integral part of all of our ecosystems. So those birds are spreading seeds around. Well, guess what? The bees are going to have more to pollinate, and they're going to do a better job at actually pollinating our wild crops, the peanuts that might be growing, 5 miles down the road, or the cotton, or whatever it may be. So, yep.
I think
that's it.
all. Yeah,
Okay.
because we already answered this one. How this organization interact with the community?
Yep.
What type of habitat? Maybe this one. What type of habitat we can encounter here?
Yeah, we did kind of touch on that.
We touched
But
on
yeah,
that.
we do have those three distinct habitat areas. So we've got the woods around us that you can see here. Back in that area is the pollinator area, the grassy kind of area that I mentioned. And of course, surrounded on the outside of this, we have the whole salt marsh ecosystem. We're part of the greater watershed. So we have a total of 142 acres of reclaimed habitat here. The lake takes up about 37 acres of that.
Okay.
So, yeah,
Nice.
about 105
Thank
land
you,
acres.
James.
You're very welcome. It was very nice to meet you. And you can see how there are no trees. That's because of that.
Okay. What's the name?
Privet. Privet. It grows so densely that the native species have no chance to re-sprout as they die off. They also allow the vines to grow on top of them very differently, which causes problems. And so we've actually lost about 1.5 acres or 2 acres of treetops in the last 3 years because of this. So that's what we're working to manage. So you can see this is an area that we're starting to work kind of aggressively, and then compare that as we get a little further up here with what the natural forest looks like. You can actually see much further back into it. It's much less the top of that risk of killing off trees. Of course, we've got less risk of forest fire through an area like this. It's harder for it